Good.
Hi. Woo! Hello.
Hey guys.
So we're London.
Sorry?
We're London. What time is it where you are?
3 in the afternoon.
3 in the afternoon. Okay, that's good. At least it's not 3 in the morning. So. That's pretty cool. So I think everyone's got lots of questions. So should we just swing straight into it? Or do you want to do a bit of intro first?
We're already at the Q&A session now?
Yeah, or do you want to do some talking first? Do you want to do a bit of intro? Or I think everyone knows who you are. Is the
yeah, I guess we can just go into Q&A.
Okay, cool. Shall we do that?
Right, someone put their hand up and then we'll come around with the mic so you can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Steve. Well, my colleagues and I are looking at a JavaScript library that we want to use, and we are contemplating between Angular and Vue.js. And we just want to ask you, why would we use Vue.js over Angular? What would be the advantage?
Are you comparing to Angular 1?
Well, we've not even used Angular at all, so 1 or 2 doesn't even...
1 or 2? Well, I think 1 or 2 are completely different frameworks, right? So I think it's a no-brainer when you're talking about Angular 1 because Vue is specifically designed to improve upon what Angular 1 offers with simplified concepts, better performance, lighter footprint, and doesn't come with its own awkward module system. Vue just encourages you to use the standard module systems. Plays better with Webpack, with hot reload, better component abstraction. Essentially, I would confidently say Vue is a better choice than Angular 1 at this moment. For Angular 2, the big question is Angular 2 ready? Are you ready to bet your thing on a framework that is still in beta, right? Google obviously has put a lot of effort into Angular 2, but they've been really slow in actually releasing it. And it has some impressive benchmarks, but Angular 2 is also really, really heavy. In case you didn't notice, the latest build is like, last time I remember, it's like 500 KB minified when you use the whole bundle. In comparison, Vue.js itself is like 70 KB minified, so that's like 7 times difference. So consider that when you're building something. On top of that, Angular 2 somewhat forces you to use TypeScript. So if you don't use TypeScript with Angular 2, you get a subpar development experience, but you don't get that when using Vue. Vue basically recommends standard ECMAScript 2015, but you can use TypeScript if you want to because there are community contributed type definitions for Vue.js and Vue router and all that stuff. So that's another thing to consider. The third thing is the official Angular workflow. Basically, their recommended workflow is with JSPM and System.js, which I don't think is as mature as Webpack is. And Vue's whole build toolchain is focused around Webpack, which leverages all the existing loaders and stuff, which gives you a basically really well-defined modular development workflow. So, so that's basically the data points that I can offer. I wouldn't, I can't say like Vue is definitely better than Angular 2, but in my opinion, it does have some advantages over it.
Just one more question. Okay, now there's still a bit that still confuses me a bit about Vue.js, and that's at present I'm using it for a simple small scale app, and I'm able to easily find my way around it a bit. But as the application gets bigger, I'm struggling with the ability to be able to load certain components or in certain areas. So sometimes it's like I just call the entire JavaScript and then use the components that I need on a relevant page. But is there a way to be able to say, for instance, let me just give an example. You have 4 components, and you want to use those components on different pages. So which means that you don't want to load all the components on in the various pages. How does one do that? How do you say, okay, on this page, I just want to use this component without having to load the entire thing?
Right. So I think so you're trying to build a multi-page app with different components on different pages. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So there are 2 ways to approach this. The first is consider if your app actually needs to be multi-paged. If it doesn't need to be, then you can still make it as a single-page app with basically making part of your routes to be lazy loaded on demand. That's one way to look at it. The other way is if you are pretty sure you want a multi-page app, you can use Webpack's. So you will have to delve into Webpack's configuration because it has the ability to allow you to use multiple entry points. So different entry points would have different dependencies. So when you build, you actually get multiple bundles with different outputs. Webpack also provides advanced plugins, allows you to extract the common dependencies of these multiple entries into a common chunk. So each page would every page would load that common chunk plus its own unique dependencies. So that's the ideal build workflow for that type of scenario. But it's a bit more complicated, and you need to understand how Webpack works in that scenario. But it's definitely possible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you. That does answer my question. Thank you.
Hi, Evan. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hi, Evan. Can you hear me at all?
Yeah, I can.
Is that, yeah? You can hear me? Okay, great. So I was just wondering when you're defining your components, what your reasoning would be between using Vue.component versus just export default, and then from there also Vue.extend.
So you're thinking about just plain JavaScript files versus the Vue file?
No, in your Vue file. So when you're structuring out your JS for your...
Oh, okay.
So you can use export default, and then the component would basically just take on the file name, whatever it is, with a separating dash. Or Vue.component, what would be your reasoning between, okay, for this one I'm going to use export default, and for this one I'm going to use Vue.component to define it?
Oh, okay. So Vue.component register a global component. So that basically it's like registering a custom element you can use anywhere. In big applications, I would recommend never use global components if your application is big. The reasoning being that similar to how you'd avoid global namespace pollution, and also from a maintenance standpoint, global components can be convenient, but let's say you're looking at a single component and you notice that this component uses several other components as templates. With local components, you would have to explicitly import those components in the same file. So you know exactly where to look for these components that this component depends on. But if you use global components, when you look at a local component that uses other components, you have no idea where these components are defined. You would have to basically go to your global component registry and look for those components individually. So I'd argue it's important to make your code easy to follow for other one working on it, right? So having explicit dependencies between your components makes your code basically have a natural dependency graph that anyone that reading your code can follow. That's the argument between local versus global components. And in terms of export default versus Vue.extend, when you do export default, you're just exporting this object. And the way Vue's component system works is when it encounters an object, when it expects a component, it just auto-converts it into a constructor. basically whenever it sees an object format component, it just calls view.extend on it automatically. And that extend result is cached onto that object. So let's say you call view.extend on the same object like multiple times, you always get back the same constructor. So it's just a convenience to allow you to you don't have to import Vue then call view.extend in every single component. You can just export the object, and also because you're exporting the raw object for the raw options object, it makes testing easier because you can just import that object, then create a separate component out of it, and then render it, test it, making it easier to assert.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hello?
If I've got a team who are primarily from a server-side background, used to working with JavaScript and bits of jQuery to extend the experience, and we haven't worked with any kind of front-end frameworks before, we've got apps where we probably never need more than 500 lines of code anyway in the page if it was JavaScript and jQuery only. Do we have to go the whole hog with Webpack, Browserify, breaking things into components, or is it reasonable to just start by saving, I will explicitly load Vue.js, have a bit less of a learning curve, and start playing around?
Definitely, yeah. I think that's the one big thing about Vue.js is you're not. I don't want to force people to use Webpack, right? So it's. I want to make it clear that Webpack-based workflow is explicitly for large single-page applications, because when only for code bases that's expected to be big, expected to be a complex client-side app, then you should use Webpack definitely. But if you know beforehand that your client side is going to be thin, and all you want is actually just leverage this sort of data-driven DOM manipulation capabilities, then by all means just drop Vue.js directly and on your page and just use it in the typical way you would just sprinkle JavaScript on your already rendered pages. I think that's a totally valid use case. But you just need to make sure you don't one day plan to evolve your front end into a full-fledged client-side app.
Yep. Great. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hi there, Evan. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Hi there. So this is a sort of organisational question, really, for you and also to Blake. And it's a question we're thinking of going with a front-end framework, and we've had a look at the options. And for LTS, we sort of went with we're sort of erring towards Ember, and so I ask you the question for you is, what are your thoughts on the idea of LTS for Vue? And for Blake, the question is, what have been your experiences with using Vue at Sainsbury's? Like, have you encountered any sort of blockers or anything like that? So first,
Was the question about LTS?
that's right, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I mentioned this in a forum post a bit earlier, but I don't think I've announced it anywhere. But there is definitely plan to make 1.1 an LTS release.
Okay.
So that's the plan. 1.1 is slated to start. I'm busy with other parts of the whole ecosystem right now, but I think 1.1 is slated to land probably in 2 or 3 months, and that one is going to be LTS. Because since 1.0, Vue has been pretty stable. In case you noticed, we have had like 21 patch releases with no major breaking changes, and that's a commitment we want to keep, right? As long as the major version stays as 1.x, there will be no public API breaking changes. If you use private methods, you are on your own. But the public API, anything documented in the docs will not change. And once 1.1 is out, it will be a LTS release. And the period of support period is, I'm still trying to, it's not decided yet, but it's going to be definitely long enough for people to consider it for serious
Sure.
projects for just to make sure it will get guaranteed bug fixes and security fixes for an extended period. So that's in the roadmap.
Okay. Thanks, Evan.
So I'll go to my answer.
Yeah.
I think when you're using LTS though, you should try and keep up to date, because it's much easier if you ever come to the point of going to update your application if you go and do it in small steps.
Right.
So if you stay on an LTS version and never look to upgrading, when it comes to 1 year down the line when you're 3 versions behind and you go, I want to upgrade, you're going to have such a
Sure.
hard time to actually update.
Yeah.
So maybe if you want to have an LTS solution because it's corporate policies or just company policies, then update when the new LTS comes out. Try and update when it happens, because I found a lot of Angular, they stay on that version and then they will never change.
Right.
And in terms of us using it in Sainsbury's, we've enjoyed using it. It's made our thinking simpler when we're approaching the solution. With Angular, we had to think what we're going to use. Is this a directive, a controller? Is it a service? But with Vue, you kind of know the core features. You've got the component, you've got the purpose of a directive. It's clearly defined as just manipulating a small amount of DOM data or extending some further functionality of that tag itself. But when you actually get to Angular or Ember, there's so much you do that you just can't work out its use case. And as our project growed, we then incorporated Vue Router and ViewX to encompass what we needed.
Okay, thanks. I mean, sorry to hijack another question on, with Ember CLI, the reason why we went with, where we liked the look of Ember was, for us back-end guys, the scaffolding seemed pretty intuitive with Ember data and providing routing and stuff like that, but Vue CLI looks a little bit younger, and so I wonder if you could possibly talk a little bit about Vue CLI. Do you know what I mean?
So Vue CLI takes a little bit different approach from say Ember CLI or like the Rails CLI. So the primary goal of Vue CLI is just scaffolding. So all it does is pulling this best practice template out of the VueJS templates repository on GitHub. And once you put it down, the dependencies and build workflow is managed just by the everything inside that repository. So Vue CLI only basically hands it off to you. From that point on, you just do npm install, and all the build scripts are just npm run scripts. So you basically get full control of your project instead of having to rely on constantly upgrading your CLI to make sure a project works. Because all the dependencies are just npm dependencies. All the build scripts are contained in the project itself. You can modify it to your needs, and it'll just stay there. So it's part of your project now. I think that's actually a more sustainable way to look at it, because if your project actually relies on a up-to-date CLI to just normally function, I think that's actually an extra dependency to tag on. But Vue CLI basically clearly separates the line where scaffolding is scaffolding and project build flow is part of project. I think that's a better way to look at it.
That makes sense. Okay, thanks, Evan.
Hello. First, I wanted to say thank you for the big effort that you've been doing with Vue. It's been very enjoyable working with you so far. My question is about, you mentioned something about the low footprint of Vue, and I was wondering if you have any examples or any stats that you can talk us about of similar applications running on Vue to an application running on the React or some other bigger framework.
I didn't quite get the first half of your question. Could you repeat it?
It's about the performance. If you have any
performance.
stats, numbers, or examples that you can tell us about.
Definitely. I've done a lot of, so there are, I've tested Vue against other frameworks in almost every micro benchmark out there. So the first time when I released Vue, there was this to-do MVC benchmark, and Vue was like literally the fastest in that benchmark. And the reason was actually a little bit on the technical side because that benchmark was flawed, like every micro benchmark, right? It was trying to like add 100 to-do items, toggle them one by one, then delete them one by one, and it's doing it synchronously. And the result is because Vue uses this asynchronous render loop, it automatically buffers all the DOM changes, right? So when you do all those DOM operations, in the end, nothing actually happened because it deleted all the to-dos. So Vue did nothing in that benchmark. And it just made Vue like 10 times faster than Angular. And it was misleading, right? So I had the benchmark out there in the beginning, and people were like, oh, you're cheating. I'm like, well, you don't need to do anything to get the benefits of the async render loop. So it's kind of like part of the framework, right? But it's still kind of technically incorrect. So I removed that benchmark. So later on, there are other benchmarks. For example, the DB Monster benchmark. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. It was this benchmark when Ember team rewrote their rendering engine with Glimmer 2. And they released this benchmark showing, hey, how fast the Ember is. We can render like a 100 by 5 table with like 20 FPS per second. And the next day, like other people released benchmarks with like React re-rendering at like 25 frames per second. And then there's like these micro frameworks, it's like rendering at like 40 FPS per second. So it kind of became like a race for all the frameworks to just like get better at that benchmark. And I also did a lot of time optimizing Vue for it. And right now, like by default, Vue runs at like 35 FPS on that benchmark on my machine, which is a MacBook Pro. And there are also like significant ways where you can optimize these things. For example, in the latest version of Vue, you can just, if you know the table is going to be static, you are just throwing a new whole data structure in every time, you can just object freeze that data structure. So Vue will completely skip observing those data and just do a static render. And that boosts up the FPS to like 50 frames per second. So just one single line change in your code, you get like 40% FPS boost on that benchmark. So so Vue is fast by default, and in critical scenarios, you can do these really fine-tuned optimizations to make it even faster. And then there's also this another benchmark which was doing like rendering a list, adding an item, then updating every 10 other items, and then re-rendering the whole list. And I can share the link after this, maybe on the meetup page or something. But essentially, Vue was among the fastest of all the things benchmarked. So nothing to worry about on the performance side. The only performance scenario which I would warn people against is when you have extremely large tables with, say, like 10,000 cells. It's a rare scenario, right? And in most cases, you would be paginating your app or limiting things into your viewport. So anything below like 10,000 cells, we can handle it easily. But when you actually run into performance issues, it's most likely you have too many cells or like v4 loops or like components on your page, and you should reconsider your design strategy because usually when you run into performance problems with Vue, it means you are presenting too many things to the user at the same time. And it's going to be information overload, and you should rethink how your design actually works. That's just the general experience I've had so far. Like personally, in practice, I've never run into areas where performance actually becomes an issue, unless you have like extremely huge scale things, which just isn't common in typical applications.
Yeah, hi Evan. It's Tom Conlon, and I also want to thank you very much indeed for your phenomenal work. I think it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. My question is around the router. Okay, if there's you have Keepalive on the component tag, yeah, but in the router, if you have lots of routes and some you don't want to reuse, but maybe some you do, and you want to keep them alive, actually. Some of those you want to keep alive, rather than writing your own saving and loading code. That's not actually part of Router at the moment, is it?
Right, yeah. So, sorry, are you finished? Am I?
Yeah, for now.
Okay.
The question
you are
was,
basically saying you want to selectively keep certain routes alive.
Yeah.
Or you have, okay, right. So right now the keep alive is basically an umbrella directive. So if you use it on the top level router view, it keeps the whole tree alive instead of keeping that single component alive. And I've come to think that keeping the component instance alive may not be the best way to go about this because of the complexity involved in managing your state when you are, when you think about a component tree and you're thinking about, oh, this instance is going to be kept alive, but these things underneath are going not, right? I think it adds a lot of mental complexity in maintaining the state of the application. I'm now more inclined to think about it in a state preserving perspective, where the component instance itself is disposable. What you actually want to keep alive is the state it contains, right? So when you use a state management solution like ViewX, we can do time travel. When you time travel, all you're doing is shoving in a new state tree, right? So if you have that state tree kept somewhere, you don't need to worry about whether your component instance is re-rendered or not, or is it the same instance or not. You're actually worried about whether when that component is rendered again, is it in the same state it was before? Does that make sense?
Pretty much. I'm not using ViewX at the moment, so currently I have to load and save to local storage on change of routes,
right.
And it's a pain. And I thought it'd be something which others would want, or but yeah, obviously if you go the whole hog and go ViewX, that's different, yeah.
So yeah, I think my general answer to the keep alive problem is I think it's going to be difficult to make it work on a fine-grained basis, and the better approach is just to attack it from the state management perspective and think about how to persist and restore your state when you reload that component, instead of thinking about keeping an instance alive without touching it. So yeah, that's what I think is the better way to do it.
Okay, thanks, Evan.
Hey, Evan.
Hi.
Like many people, I think I came to Vue through the Laravel ecosystem and Jeffrey Way and etc. And I have been using it on lots of smaller apps using Laravel Elixir, which uses Browserify and enables you a sort of really accessible way of using Vue components in a structured way, as Blake was talking about earlier. However, I know that you recommend Webpack, and as Blake was also saying. So I just wondered, like, briefly, if you kind of could just give us some feedback on like when you would why you recommend Webpack, and sort of what downsides you see with Browserify, and whether you've persuaded Jeffrey Way to rewrite Elixir yet.
Oh, okay. So I think Browserify also has its own benefits in that it's relatively easier to use than Webpack. Webpack's configuration its documentation is also pretty confusing, so it's kind of hard for people to jump into it. On the contrary, Browserify requires relatively minimal configuration to work. But the biggest difference between Browserify and Webpack is Webpack basically is a tool with an opinion. It's opinionated in that it treats everything as a module. So your CSS is a module, your HTML5 is a module, your even less Sass or even your image files, your static assets are all modules. And the way Webpack works with them is when you use Webpack to load your CSS and HTML, it actually parses all the content of them and extracts those relative URLs. And it will see that your HTML file is referencing an image file, and it will treat that as a module dependency. So it knows like these two files are related, and it will then use a loader to process the image file, and it will basically get the local file path, and it can smartly rewrite your HTML file to point that file URL, change that relative URL into a absolute URL when you build for production. So I guess in short, the whole benefit of this is all your asset files can use relative file paths to refer to one another all together in the same source in the source folder. And you don't need to worry about when this file is deployed server on server, it's going to be at this URL instead of this local relative relationship. So Webpack basically takes care of all that for you if you configure it properly. So and it enables a lot of like powerful features like for example, it can conditionally inline your image files as base64 string if it's smaller than a certain threshold, or it can automatically run optimizations on your images before it copies it to the production like output. Overall, like Webpack is just like provides you all these advanced features and also code splitting. For example, you're building a multi-route app and you want to lazy load some of the routes. And Webpack makes it trivially easy because it's just a built-in feature. But with Browserify, it's just really hard. You have to like struggle with like a lot of third-party plugins, and it may not just work right. But that said, what Browserify does really well is the mental model is simpler, I guess. Like when you have Elixir already working with the Laravel app, it's sort of straightforward to get started. Like you don't need to jump through, understand how Webpack works, but I think it really depends on the scenario. Similar to how earlier we talked about, it's totally legit to just drop Vue on the page and use it as using plain JavaScript without Browserify even. That's a valid use case. So using Browserify with Laravel is also valid if you are building a multi-page app where you are essentially having a separate like bundle built for each of your apps. I think that also makes sense. But in the end, it depends on the scale of your project. If your project is complex enough that the benefits of the Webpack module philosophy outweighs the cost of learning it and configuring it properly, then you should go with Webpack, right? If you feel that Browserify is serving you really well and you don't feel the urge to try Webpack, then feel free to stay with Browserify. I think like the whole philosophy of Vue is like we have these different paths to achieve your goal, and it all depends on where your goal is. Instead of forcing you to say this is the one and only way to do it. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that was a really good answer. Thank you. Thanks. I have one more question, very briefly. Do you have any plans to talk in Europe in July?
So yeah, currently the plan is I will probably be attending Laracon EU, and also I'll be speaking at Nordic.js in Sweden in September. That's in Stockholm, I believe. I think that's the two upcoming occasions that will probably be in Europe, but I think it's planned. It might change, but that's currently planned. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Hi, Evan. I also want to congratulate you on the work of the framework. I think it's like a breath of fresh air on the frameworks battle. And I also want to congratulate Blake for making to the core team, which I think it's like amazing asset. My question is about ViewX. I've been using it, and I understand what getters do, kinda. And my question is, say for instance I have a product list on my state and I want to retrieve like one product by ID. I would like directly on the component, I would access the store and the state and the product list, and then I'll put the ID on the array or whatever, and then it will retrieve the product for me. But now let's say that I want to retrieve the product by name. So, and you know, I would do it like iterating on the array and just matching the name and retrieving it. So on the component, I can define this getter, which will give me a subfilter. Sorry, a subset of the state. But I don't have any way to pass an argument to it.
Right.
And that to me feels a bit weird, because obviously I could define like a method which would take care of that for me, and I could even make it a mixin, so I could reuse it in other components. But what I'm trying to say is that literally I would like ViewX to handle the state for me. Like, I would say something like getters, but I would be able to pass arguments and compute upon those arguments. Yeah.
I think here's the way to look at it. I actually just was looking at the GitHub issue you opened.
Yeah, I opened it actually. but I guess like I have the opportunity to speak directly, so I think it would be cool.
Yeah. So I thought about this, and it really depends on how you think about it. So I guess the naive way to think about it is you want to pass an argument to the getter. But where does that argument come from, right? Is it part of your component own state? Or is it coming from the URL, or is it coming from somewhere, right? It has to come from somewhere, and it's also part of the application state. So the way I look at it is, if that's part of the application state, it should be in the ViewX store as well. So for example, you have a page, you want to display a product by name. What you have in your ViewX store is first the products array, or the product hash, any way you want to structure it. The other, you would have an additional property in the ViewX store called current product name. So in your getter, because that's part of your ViewX state now, so in the getter, you can use that state. So in the getter, you're basically saying current, like say current product name equals state.current product name, and then you use that thing to filter through your state.product to find your product. So everything is contained within your ViewX store, and everything can be calculated inside getters. And now you have it, right? And the benefits of that is because, and the reason why ViewX getters do not accept arguments is because when you pass external arguments that can be different in each component, that makes this getter impure based on your local component state. And that essentially forces this getter to reevaluate for every single component using it when its dependency changes, because you don't know whether each component may have different input arguments, so the result may be different. The benefits of forcing it to only accept the state as the only argument is that it becomes solely dependent on the state, so it's globally cacheable. So let's say you have like 10,000 components all using the same ViewX getter. When something changes, that ViewX getter only to reevaluate once and caches its value, and every one of those components accessing that getter will get the same value instantly without having to reevaluate it again. So that's the reasoning behind forcing it to be pure. And the way to make it work with, say, a product ID or product name is by putting that ID or name into your application state as well.
Okay, so let's say it's literally just an input and you want to like filter a table with products.
Right.
That input takes like a number or a name, and then it will filter the table just to show that specific product.
So you would add a listener on your input, and on that listener, you would just call an action, say set current product ID.
Okay, got it. Yeah. So you would keep
the whole flow. You know, unidirectional data.
It's like I didn't want it to change the way that getters work as they are now, because it makes sense what you just said, like total sense. But if it's something that is gonna keep changing, like you're gonna keep filtering, I think that passing an argument, say it's not getters, say something else. Right. I would think it makes sense, because I would have to trigger like a mutation of the state just to update a value that will keep constantly updating when the user is on that component. And then when he moves away, the state is not there anymore. And I don't need that current name or whatever.
But I mean, when the user is typing, is your component state updating? If it's updating, then it makes sense to trigger a mutation, right?
But the state doesn't update because the product list is always the same.
Well, it does update.
Okay.
Right? Like, I mean, the state. Think about it as this. So, state contains both data and your displaying state, right? The current product ID is a displaying state. It's temporary to your client-side application, but it is indeed part of the application state. State is not only something you retrieve from the server. State is also the current state describing what your interface looks like to the user right now, right? So if the user is filtering something and he or she expects the interface to be different based on that value he inputs, then that value is part of the application state because it determines how your interface is rendered.
Got it. Cheers. Yeah. Thank you. Can I just make one more question? Just really quick. This is not technical one, so yeah. So developers, like, we get recruiters calling us with jobs saying like we need Angular experience, and I would like to envision a future where a recruiter is going to call me saying like, do you have Vue.js experience? And I know that you like recently introduced this sponsorship type of thing into your framework, and it's very nice. What my question is, apart from that type of sponsorship, are you like actively pursuing this type of like market prospect of Vue.js developers? And if you are, like, what would be your thoughts on it? Like, how would you make this happen? Or maybe you're not actively pursuing it and just hoping that it turns out to be like that. But my question is pretty much like, are you actively doing something for this to happen? Thanks, man.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess currently the work is limited to just maintaining the Twitter account and just like, occasionally writing some blog posts. But actually the talks that I'm going to be giving later this year is part of the, promotion, the marketing plan. Right? Like I'm actually going to be speaking at quite a few conferences later this year just to talk about Vue-related topics. Like maybe not entirely about Vue, but like I was sneaking some Vue content in there. So that's part of the thing. And the other is I will probably also work with to work on some more training resources like videos or maybe books in the future to sort of promote it further. And I think right now my focus is getting the whole, so let's think about the Vue ecosystem as the core is currently already 1.0, and we have these ecosystem things like CLI and the Webpack workflow and the router and ViewX. So all these things are separate pieces, and there are a few of them are still not like, I wouldn't call them 1.0 yet. So the focus right now is to get everything on top of 1.0, and then we can call this platform ready. And that's when I plan to just really make a big wave about it and push it even further beyond its current state. Because currently I think there's still a big misconception in the industry where people are thinking, oh, Vue.js is just this lightweight thing, like for beginners. No, it's not, right? Like it's easy for beginners, but it's also great for anything you want to build. So I want to get the actual content ready, and then we will I will probably make some effort to represent Vue as this complete solution where for your front end, any type of front end project you want to build, you can use Vue. That's the goal.
Thanks, Ben. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Thanks.
It's been a good evening, and yeah, you're brilliant at answering these questions. So I'm going to hang up on you now because we have to wrap up. It's nearly 9 o'clock.
Cool. Thanks to you and Blake for organizing, hosting it, and also shout out to Jack
Yeah.
and everyone who and thanks for everyone for coming.